On today's Murder, She Wrote podcast, we get introduced to the one, the only, Harry McGraw, one of the best recurring detectives in the history of Murder, She Wrote. Let's get started. Hello guys, and welcome to the Murder, She Wrote podcast, where I watch every single episode of the hit 80s/90s show Murder, She Wrote, starring 3-time Academy Award nominee and 5-time Tony Award winner Miss Angela Lansbury. Today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 15, Tough Guys Don't Die. Air date, February 24th, 1985. How I arrived at that number is that on the app Peacock, NBC's streaming service that is now free, that you can watch Murder, She Wrote for free, they have the pilot movie, which aired first before the first episode, that they syndicated into 2 different episodes when the show would air on various networks. So you don't count the pilot movie as an episode. The very first episode of the show was Deadly Lady. So this is officially the 15th episode of Season 1. I have the whole, I verified this, and the episode numbers will be correct from now on. There will be no confusion when I do Season 2, I promise you. Also, and I'm going to say this in every episode too, if this is the first time that you're listening to my Murder, She Wrote podcast, I spoil everything in the episode. I talk about who the killer is, all the plot points, all the twists and turns, everything there is to talk about, because that's what you're supposed to do. So if you've not watched this episode, and you own the DVDs like I do, get out your Season 1 DVD, put Disc 5 into your DVD player, and it's the first episode on Disc 5 of Season 1. If you are on the app Peacock, and that's how you're watching the show, it will probably list this episode as episode 14. It actually lists this episode as episode 17, but it's actually episode 15. Okay? So I implore you to go on the Peacock app on your Roku, or wherever it is that you watch it, and watch the episode first, and then come back and listen to this episode. Because from this point on in the episode, I'm going to be talking about the episode, so spoiler alert. This is your final warning. If you've not seen this episode, please leave now. Or if you haven't seen the episode and you just don't care, then by all means continue to listen. Because here we go. We start off this episode in Boston with a detective on the phone talking to Mrs. Fletcher, named Archie Miles. She's having him do an investigation for an old murder case from 25 years ago, the old Danbury scalpel murder case, which happened 25 years ago because she's doing a book on it. Mr. Miles tells her that anyone that was associated with that case is either dead or he can't track them down, although he was able to find a lead of a nurse in a neighboring town. And he was going to get back to her and tell her about that lead a little bit later. He gets off the phone with her, and he starts making notes in a tape recorder. Suddenly he hears someone coming in. He asks if that's Elma, his secretary, and when he goes to the door to look, someone's standing there with a gun pointed at him, and he gets shot twice and is murdered. We then get introduced to a character named Mr. Santini. And Mr. Santini is at a construction site in his office, and he gets a call from someone asking if he heard the news. He opens his newspaper and we see an article that says, "Detective gunned down Archie Miles." And Mr. Santini says, "Wow, that's the guy that's been following me. What do you know?" We then get introduced to another character named Priscilla Daniels, who is the owner and editor of Femininity magazine, a feminist magazine that talks about today's women. Well, today's women, meaning whatever women were doing in 1985. I don't know because I was not born until 1989, so I don't know. She's coming back from Paris, and her ex-husband, Aaron, comes up to them and says that the detective that was looking into her has been killed, and that they should be concerned. But we don't exactly know just yet what this has to do with her. Meanwhile, we find ourselves back in Cabot Cove. Mrs. Fletcher is looking out her window at a man who is sitting in his car, reading a newspaper and casually glancing and watching her house. She decides to go out on her bike, drives past his car, looking at him as she goes, and then as soon as she's gone, he gets out of his car, goes into her house, and begins going through her things. She then comes in and says, "Looking for something? Who are you?" And this is Harry McGraw. He was Archie Miles' partner, and he's investigating his murder. He thought that since Mrs. Fletcher had hired Mr. Miles to do research on the Granberry case, that it might have something to do with his murder. Mrs. Fletcher then feels that it's her fault and insists upon helping Mr. McGill investigate, not wanting to be the cause of his murder. But Mr. McGill really and truly does not want her help, and says that he does better working alone. Harry McGill is played by Jerry Orsback. And I'll get to all his credentials and everything about him toward the end of the episode, but I just want to say a few things at this point. He starred with Angela Lansbury in one of my all-time favorite Disney films, Beauty and the Beast, the original 1991 version. He voiced Le Maire and gave us one of the best Disney songs in the history of Disney songs, Be Our Guest, as Angela Lansbury gave us an awesome song in Disney history, Beauty and the Beast. Jerry Orsback was also the original Billy Flynn in Chicago on Broadway and got a Tony Award for that role. Angela Lansbury and him know each other from Broadway, and they're friends in real life. And you can tell that in all the scenes they're in. And that's how he got the character of Harry McGraw, and it's tailor-made for him. Apparently the character of Harry McGraw was so popular that they tried to spin him off on his own series called The Law and Harry McGraw. Unfortunately, it only lasted one season, but I would love to check it out. Alright, back to the episode. I just love Jerry Orbach. I grew up with him on the original Law and Order, and I just think that he was such a wonderfully talented actor. More on him a little bit later. So Mrs. Fletcher goes to Mrs. Miles to apologize for his death, and Mrs. Miles is short with her and tells her to go away and leave her alone. Meanwhile, Harry decides to keep tailing Mr. Santini. He relieves his other detective, Ray Kravis, and decides to follow Mr. Santini when he starts to drive somewhere. As he's driving, he's putting his notes into a tape recorder when suddenly Mr. Santini pulls into an alley. A bunch of cars surround Harry's car, and Mr. Santini gets out with a smile on his face and waves to Harry, and then one of the construction workers that works for Mr. Santini says, "This is a message from Mr. Santini," and punches Harry in the face. When Harry comes to his office, Mrs. Fletcher is there waiting for him. She insists upon helping him with the investigation because she wants to know what led to Mr. Miles's death. Harry reveals to her that he was working on 3 distinct cases. He was doing background information for the Granbury murder case 25 years ago, the murder case. He also was investigating Priscilla Daniels, and Mrs. Fletcher knows exactly who she is, because she's the owner of that magazine I mentioned earlier, Femininity magazine. She says that Miss Daniels has been after her for several years to publish an article in her magazine, but she's been reluctant. And the second case concerns Mr. Santini. His wife hired Mr. Miles because she believes that Mr. Santini is having an affair. And since he had his employees beat Harry up, Harry believes that it's true. And says that he does not need Mrs. Fletcher's help. So Mrs. Fletcher decides to go see Detective Sparky. Yes, that is his actual name. And she demands to know why there isn't an investigation into Mr. Miles's death. Why does it seem that none of the cops are on it in trying to figure out who killed him? Detective Sparky basically tells Mrs. Fletcher that Mr. Miles taught at the police academy and was a well-respected man. They are leaving it to Harry McGraw because they hope that when Harry finds whoever shot Mr. Miles, that he will do something about it. And she goes, but that means that Mr. McGraw will be the judge, jury, and executioner, and that's not right. He says, well, Mr. Miles was a well-respected man around here, and quite frankly, we're not happy about his death. So whatever Harry does, we'll turn the other cheek. So Mrs. Fletcher decides to take it upon herself to go see Miss Daniels herself. She expresses interest in writing a letter, but much to the surprise of Miss Daniels, it's not about her writing mystery novels or anything to the contrary. And it's a remembrance to her husband, Frank. Suddenly, Miss Daniels says, this is a feminist magazine about today's women, about women having a career and not having to rely on a man and having a husband and a family. Which, I've often seen this portrayed in movies and TV shows where it's often women have to choose between one or the other, either having a family or a career. I especially hate those Hallmark Channel original movies where the woman gets transported to an alternate universe where first she was a lawyer and she was successful and she had no family or anything, and then she gets transported to this alternate universe where she suddenly has a minivan and soccer practice and she's a mom. It's like, why can't women be mothers and have careers? Believe me, women can do it all. Sometimes they do it better than a man. I firmly believe that as a man of this podcast. So I think women should be able to do whatever it is they want to do. And they shouldn't have to choose between having a career or having a husband. That's apparently why Miss Daniels divorced her husband even though she still loves him. Because she wants to, because I guess the underlining statement, and I'm only guessing so don't criticize me for this comment, but apparently she's saying to be a feminist you can't be married, which I've never heard that before. I don't know exactly what they're trying to say in this episode, but again, in my official capacity as host of this podcast, I say that women can do anything as well as a man can do, sometimes even better. So I think women can have a career and family. They can have it all. If men can do it, so can women. Anyway, Miss Daniels is reluctant to allow Mrs. Fletcher to publish the letter about her husband, but then says, you know what, maybe we'll find somewhere to put it, if that's what you really want to do. She then invites Mrs. Fletcher to a party celebrating 5 years that she's had the magazine. Mrs. Fletcher graciously accepts. Meanwhile, in the lobby, and that's in your visual aid, Harry McGraw comes in dressed like a cowboy from Texas, pretending to be in advertising to get background on Miss Daniels. There's a funny exchange when he introduces himself as someone else. I didn't catch his name, that he pretends that he is. And Mrs. Fletcher doesn't blow his cover and just goes along with it. And you can tell that they're having fun with this in the scene, because you can tell there's a couple of times where Angela Lansbury's trying not to laugh, and he's trying not to laugh too. So from that scene alone, you can tell that they were good friends in real life. And like I said, he was such a great actor. So anyway, that night when Mrs. Fletcher returns to her hotel room, she finds Harry sitting alone in the dark, smoking a cigarette, waiting for her. She says, "You know, Mr. McGraw, breaking and entering is becoming a habit of yours." He says, "Mrs. Fletcher, I appreciate what you did down at Miss Daniels' office. You know, not blowing my cover and everything, but I don't need your help. Why don't you go back to writing mysteries or doing needlepoint or whatever it is you do?" She said, "Actually, that's why I started writing my mystery novels, because I got quite bored with needlepoint." So Harry finally gives in and says, "All right, Mrs. Fletcher, you're a tough cookie, all right? So why don't you come to my office tomorrow morning and we'll go over the files together." Mrs. Fletcher agrees. Later the next night, she goes to Miss Daniels' party, and she realizes from the files that her and Harry has gone through that Miss Daniels has political aspirations, that apparently there is a run for the Senate seat the following year, which would be 1986, and she might try to get it. Try to nab it or something. So Mrs. Fletcher talks about this at the party. And she runs into Miss Daniels' ex-husband, and he says, "Our arrangement is really weird. We're divorced, but we live together and we still love each other. But because of her public image, we can't be married." Again, I don't know what they're trying to say here. So in the midst of that, we get introduced to Judge Telhoun, who apparently was involved in the Granbury scalpel murder case 25 years ago. When Mrs. Fletcher begins talking to him about it, he tells her to let sleeping dogs lie and to not worry about it. Mrs. Fletcher then realizes at the party, and I have to say this too, when she's at this party, she's wearing a really bad, ugly red dress that looks like they stole it from Little Orphan Annie. I don't often criticize Angela Lansbury's wardrobe because they do a really good job of dressing her in good clothes, but this is unfortunately one moment that dress did not look good. I did not like it at all. Anyway, Mrs. Fletcher realizes over the course of the party and goes back to see Mr. McGraw, where she tells him that she believes that the person that hired Mr. Miles to investigate Miss Daniels was Miss Daniels herself. She has political aspirations, and she was just checking to see if anyone could dig up any information on her, like reporters and such. I wonder if real politicians do that nowadays. I have no idea. But anyway, Mrs. Fletcher goes to Mr. Miles's wife, who apologizes for her rudeness the other day, and Mrs. Fletcher says, "Don't you worry about it. I totally understand. I've been there myself, and I totally understood where you were coming from. There's no need to apologize." Well, Miss Miles gives Jessica a paper that she found in Mr. Miles's coat pocket, and it has the name of the city that he was talking about on the phone earlier in the episode. Mrs. Fletcher decides to get on a bus and go investigate. She goes into an insurance place and runs into a woman who's at the reception desk. When Mrs. Fletcher begins asking about the woman named Mabel, I didn't catch her last name, the woman freaks out, says she doesn't know who she's talking about, and runs from the room. A random man whose name I also didn't catch, comes out and explains that the woman is very high-strung and very upset right now because her parents have just recently died in a fire. Apparently, her parents were prominent citizens for 25 years in this town, and they had run a nursing home and died in a fire when trying to save the patients who were mainly bedridden. So she's quite distraught over that, which is dreadful in itself. When Mrs. Fletcher comes out of the office, she asks the man, does her first name happen to be Martha? And he says, yes, as a matter of fact it is. Mrs. Fletcher puts two and two together. When she goes out the door, she runs into the judge from the party who offers to take her back to Boston. Apparently, all the places that she's going is around Maine, and I'm not very good at geometry, so I could not tell you exactly how far away these places are from each other. Apparently you can take a bus and then you can drive back. That's all I know. So on the way back, the judge tells her the case, and then Mrs. Fletcher tells Harry. Apparently it went like this. A man came to the hospital to visit his sister who was in isolation due to being raped. And there was a patient there that happened to be the rapist that raped her. And in a blind rage, her brother stabbed her rapist with a scalpel. And in circumstantial evidence got the surgeon that happened to be on call that night on trial for murder. When they realized the circumstances and how it happened, the lawyer was able to sort of taint the evidence to get him an acquittal. The doctor has since died, and apparently Martha changed her name so no one would be able to find her to question her about it. Given the severity of the case, Miss Fletcher decides that she is not going to write a book about it and to let sleeping dogs lie like the judge wanted her to in the first place. Harry says, well, you think that that rapist deserved to be murdered, but you don't want me to murder Mr. Miles's killer? And Jessica says, the difference between that is that everyone in that case is now dead and gone. But the person who killed killed Archie Miles is very much alive. And he deserves a trial and to be convicted of murder the right way, not your way, Harry. So later that night, Mrs. Fletcher insists upon seeing the files again, and she has Ray Kravis drive her. But before that happens, Ray comes and says that Mr. Santini had shot at him. But there's no evidence to suggest that he wasn't shot. The shots were fired into his car in his seat. The bullets match the same gun that fired the bullets that killed Mr. Miles. Mrs. Fletcher then goes up to the office and is going through the files when she notices that there's a page missing. Harry then tells her that Miss Daniels made a press conference saying that she had no intention of running for anything and that all her political ambitions were rumors. Mrs. Fletcher puts two and two together and goes to Miss Daniels' house. She confronts her and says, Miss Daniels, you did have political ambitions. Now please tell me what is going on. And Mrs. Daniels denies it, and then finally her ex-husband, comes down the stairs and says, tell her a man has been murdered and we need to find out why. Apparently, about 25 years ago, about the same time period that the Granbury murder case took place, apparently Miss Daniels and her ex-husband met in college. She was a grad student, he was a professor. They had an affair, she got pregnant, and she decided to get an abortion. Well, she went out of the country to do it, and apparently it wasn't done very well, and she can no longer have children. And she hired Mr. Miles to basically dig into her past to see if he could find that, and unfortunately he did. So she decided not to run for public office or for the Senate or whatever it was she was going to run for, because, according to her, being the head of a feminist magazine as well as running for the Senate, she would be written as a gigantic hypocrite, because you cannot run for that with abortion hanging over your head. Because none of them, nor her ex-husband nor her, were in the position to raise the child at the time, which is why she had an abortion. So she decides not to run for office, but she did receive a mysterious phone call from a person claiming they wanted $3 million to stay quiet and not tell the public about her abortion. But instead of paying the man, she just publicly denied that she was running at all. So that pretty much ruined the whole blackmail scheme. From this, Mrs. Fletcher figures out who the killer is. She then goes to see Detective Sparky, who is on his way home. As they're standing outside the police station, suddenly a car arrives, and it's Mr. Santini. He opens the back door and pulls Harry out. Apparently they got into a fight off screen. Harry got a few licks in this time. And they go into Detective Sparky's office. Basically, Mr. Santini demands to know why this guy has been following him, because his wife just told him that she hired him. Mrs. Fletcher says, well, you have to admit, Mr. Santini, you've been disappearing a lot lately. Your wife, it was bound to get suspicious. He said, well, you want to know what I've done? It's almost our 24th wedding anniversary. We used to have this boat, but I had to sell it because I lost a couple of construction jobs. But now I've been doing real good, and I've been trying to restore it. So I hired a boat carpenter who's basically rebuilding it as a surprise for our anniversary. She's a hypochondriac. I love that woman. She may drive me crazy, but I still love her. So Mr. Santini is no longer a suspect, and he's free to go. But Detective Sparky says, excuse me, but do you two realize that we've just now lost our suspect? And Mrs. Fletcher says, actually, as a matter of fact, that's what I was coming to tell the two of you. I know who killed Mr. Miles. The only problem is proving it. Later that night, Ray Kravis comes into the office after unlocking the door with his keys and asks Mrs. Fletcher what was so urgent that he had to come there right away. She explains to him that Harry got into another fight with Mr. Santini and that he got beat up pretty bad again, but he also managed to hit Mr. Santini a couple of times too. And then she says, and Mr. Santini has not been cheating on his wife. He's been building a boat for her. He's been cleared, also, of shooting Mr. Miles. He says, well, what about him almost acing me last night? And this is so funny. Mrs. Fletcher goes, Mr. Santini did not try to ace you last night. You did that to put suspicion on him. He goes, you're crazy, lady. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? When you came in, you had to unlock the door because Amelia always locked it when she left. Suddenly, Mrs. Fletcher gets up and goes behind Harry's desk and plays a tape. We hear Mr. Kravis coming in with his keys, and Mrs. Fletcher asking if that's him, and then she stops playing the tape. She said, on the night that Mr. Miles was murdered, Amelia locked the door like she always does. So the only way that someone could have killed Mr. Miles is they had to have a key. She then puts in the tape that Mr. Miles had made that night after he got off the phone with Mrs. Fletcher. And we then hear the keys jingling in the door just like before. She says, that is the sound of your keys coming through the door, Mr. Krause. You killed Mr. Miles because he was investigating Priscilla Daniels, and he found out about her abortion. And you felt that that was an opportunity for blackmail. And you knew that Mr. Miles was not the type of man that would allow something like that to take place. So you had to murder him in order to blackmail her, because there was only 3 people in this office that knew about it. You, Mr. Miles, and Mr. McGraw, sorry. So only you, and only you alone, could have shot Mr. Miles. Basically, he gets out a gun and says, "You know what, lady? You're too smart for your own good." And suddenly, Harry appears. He says, "Do it, Ray. Just flinch. Give me an excuse to shoot you. And you better hope and pray, Ray, that you get convicted, because that's the only way that you're gonna live." So, all's well that ends well. Harry offers to take Mrs. Fletcher home, and he says, "You know what, Mrs. Fletcher? You need to stop writing the books and go into business with me. We can solve crimes. I mean, you're a bona fide detective, you know that?" She goes, "Well, it has a nice ring to it, but I think I'll stick to my books." And that's the end of the episode. I love this episode, you guys. It had 3 different cases with all kinds of twists and turns, and there was a lot of noticeable guest stars. In fact, one of them has something in common with Jerry Orsbeck. Not just Angela Lansbury, because she worked with him on Beauty and the Beast, but also something else. But let's go over the guest stars. First, we had Barbara Babcock as Priscilla Daniels. Barbara Babcock has been in everything you can think of and more. She's a character actress. She's guest starred on The Golden Girls. She's known for Far and Away, Space Cowboys, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, and Hill Street Blues. She's been on everything. Her last known credit is Judging Amy. And this is not her only episode of Murder, She Wrote. She will appear in a handful of others, and she will also appear in the failed spin-off, The Law and Harry McGraw. And like I said, she guest starred on The Golden Girls as Blanche's sister. Virginia, or no, the other one. But she's awesome. Oh, she was on the original Dallas as well. But she's awesome, and anything she's in, she's just convincing. In whatever role she plays. John McMartin played Gavin Daniels. He unfortunately passed away in 2016 at the age of 86. He looked familiar to me. He's known for Blowout, All the President's Men, No Reservations, and The Dish. He's been in 82 different things. His last known credit is 2015's Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. He was on the original Law and Order. He guest starred on Touched by an Angel. This will not be his only episode of Murder, She Wrote. So maybe he guest starred on The Golden Girls as well. In an episode I just watched, Forgive Me, Father. That was a funny episode. Awesome actor. Nice to see him. He was really good. Alright, let's go over Jerry Orsbeck's credits here as Harry McGraw. He unfortunately passed away in 2004 at the age of 69. He will be forever remembered on Law and Order, the original Law and Order as Detective Lenny Briscoe, the original Beauty and the Beast, The Father in Dirty Dancing, and Crimes and Misdemeanors. And he has something in common with the guest star, Alex Rocco, who played Mr. Santini. They both played Dorothy's love interest on The Golden Girls, the same character of Glenn O'Brien, when in the Golden Girls first season. Well, no, Jerry appeared in the second to last season of the Golden Girls, and Alex Rocco played Glenn O'Brien first, and Jerry played him second. I find that to be fascinating. Our murderer was played by Gerald S. O'Lonigan. I hope I said that right. He tragically died in... Well, he didn't tragically die. I'm just saying he died in 2015 at the age of 93. He's known for The Rookies, Cop Hater, In Cold Blood, and Twilight's Last Gleaming, a movie. He was in 117 different things, and this will not be his only episode of Murder, She Wrote. He'll appear in a handful of others. He had quite the career. Trapper John M.D., Quincy M.E., Simon & Simon, Roots, The Next Generation. Awesome actor. Very convincing as the killer. Then, like I said, Alex Rocco played Mr. Santini. And I know him from several things. He died in 2015 at the age of 79. He's known for the original Godfather, The Wedding Planner, Find Me Guilty, and Smoking Aces. And he was acting way up until the end. His last known credit is Don't Sleep from 2017. He was on episodes with Matt LeBlanc from Friends. He did some voiceover work in Batman Year One. He was on Private Practice, ER, The Division, one of my favorite shows. Touched by an Angel, another one of my favorite shows. One Life to Live. He did some voiceover work on The Simpsons. He played Joe Pomnichek, Nancy McKeon's father on The Facts of Life. That's what I recognize him from. He was on the original Hotel, T.J. Hooker, and he'll appear in another episode of Murder, She Wrote. So he had quite the career. Awesome guy. He was really great. He either played shady characters or genuine characters. And Detective Sparky was played by Paul Winfield. And a fun fact about him, he played in a mini-series about Martin Luther King, and there's a picture of Martin Luther King hanging in his office in this episode. He died in 2004 at the age of 64. He's known for Star Trek II, The Terminator, Mars Attacks, and Cliffhanger. His last known credit is doing voiceover work for videos for kids about the Bible. He got started on Touched by an Angel, Crossing Jordan, did some voiceover work for Batman Beyond and The Simpsons, and Spider-Man, The Magic School Bus, so he was a voiceover artist. Ooh, and Gargoyles, love that. I loved that cartoon when I was little. Babylon 5, that was an interesting show. Batman the Animated Series, Star Trek The Next Generation, 227, Wise Guy, The Women of Brewster Place. This is his only episode of Murder, She Wrote. Yeah, he played Martin Luther King in a miniseries based on King's life in 1978. So he had quite the career. It's nice. He was really great in this episode. And then the judge was played by Fritz Weaver. He looked familiar. I think he's been in another episode of Murder, She Wrote. I think I've seen him before. He died in 2016 at the age of 90. He's known for the Thomas Crown Affair, Marathon Man, Creepshow, and This Must Be the Place. He acted way up until the end. His last known credit is 2016's The Congressman. He was in the original Law and Order. He did some narration work for Biography. He guest starred on Frasier, The X-Files, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, All My Children, as Hugo Merrick. Maybe that's where I've seen him before. On Friday the 13th, the series. Oh, and he will appear in a couple other episodes of Murder, She Wrote. That's probably why he seems familiar to me. He was in The Twilight Zone, The Love Boat, Quincy MD, Magnum P.I., the TV miniseries. That's where I've seen him before. The TV miniseries Holocaust with Meryl Streep. Yeah, that's where I've seen him, because we watched that in school. Really great actor. He had quite the impressive career. Let's see. And that's it. That is it. That is all our prominent guest stars, and I absolutely love this episode. All the twists and turns, the introduction of Harry McGraw. Fantastic episode. And I'm on disc 5, like I said, and I don't have that much more to go with season 1. And thank you all again for your support and watching the episodes. I appreciate it more than you will ever know. Thank you for watching, and happy crime solving, and I'll see you in the next one.